Today we will witness an extraordinary story, an intellectual exchange that will touch both reason and soul. A 7-year-old Muslim girl from Chile will engage in a profound conversation with an atheist professor about the existence of God. This confrontation will not be driven by anger or strong emotions, but by sound logic and compelling arguments. At a prestigious university located in Santiago, Chile, works a renowned philosophy professor named Dr. Hector Brau. He is widely known for his sharp intellect and firm atheist stance. For years, he has maintained that God is merely a human construct, an idea created by man. In his lectures, he constantly challenges his students to prove the existence of a supreme being, but so far, no one has been able to refute his claims. However, who would have thought that his most unexpected opponent would be a little girl? In another part of the city, a young Muslim girl named Noemi Perez heads toward the university auditorium accompanied by her father, Carl Perez, an engineer who also practices Islam. Noemi is a remarkable child known for her intellectual brilliance despite her young age. Since she was very small, she has shown deep curiosity about matters related to the cosmos, existence, and spirituality. She has been raised in an environment where she was taught that Islam is a religion that values both knowledge and reasoning. That day, her father decided to take her to a public lecture given by Dr. Hector Brau. The talk was titled, God, Myth or Reality? Carl knew it would be a challenging debate, but he wanted Noemi to witness how science and faith can interact in harmony. The auditorium was filled with students and people eager to hear the professor's ideas. Dr. Hector Brau stepped up to the podium and began his presentation with full confidence. Dear brothers and sisters, his voice echoed through the auditorium. For centuries, humanity has believed in the existence of God, but what scientific evidence do we have for this? None. It is merely a tradition passed down from generation to generation. To understand the universe, the idea of a divine being is unnecessary. If God truly exists, his presence should be provable by scientific methods, not just through faith. The audience fell silent. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked uncertain. After an hour presenting scientific arguments that questioned the existence of God, Dr. Gutierrez issued a challenge. If there is anyone in this room capable of proving, with solid and irrefutable logic, that God is real, I will admit I am wrong. No one dared to speak. The students looked at one another. Some tried to formulate ideas in their minds, but hesitated, afraid to face the professor's intellect. Suddenly, and without warning, a small hand rose into the air. All eyes turned to a girl of about 7, seated in the middle of the auditorium. Dr. Gutierrez gave a slightly incredulous smile. Well, it seems we have our youngest participant. What's your name, little one? My name is Noemi Perez, professor. Noemi replied firmly, standing up without a hint of doubt. Dr. Gutierrez laughed. Very well, Noemi. Are you going to try to prove that God exists? Noemi nodded confidently. Yes, professor. And I'm going to do it using a glass of milk. The auditorium buzzed with murmurs. Some students laughed, thinking it was a childish idea. However, Noemi's face remained calm. From his seat, her father looked at her with visible pride. Dr. Gutierrez raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Milk? And how can a glass of milk prove that God is real? With a slight smile, Noemi replied, I'll explain, professor. But first, could someone bring me a glass of milk? Driven by curiosity, one of the seminar organizers rushed to the cafeteria and returned with the requested glass. Noemi took it gently and held it up so everyone could see. Professor, she began, would you agree that this milk has a rather sophisticated composition? It contains proteins, calcium, vitamins, and various nutrients that are highly beneficial. Of course, Dr. Gutierrez confirmed. That's a scientific fact. And would you also agree that this milk comes from cows? Yes, milk is obtained from cows, he answered again. Noemi smiled. Now, if we think about it logically, where does this milk come from? From the cow's mammary glands? The professor explained patiently. Very good, Noemi continued. Cows produce milk thanks to what they eat, grass and water. But professor, have you ever wondered why grass is green? Water is transparent. Cows eat only that. And yet the milk they produce is white and full of nutrients? The room went silent again. Some students looked at the professor with curiosity. Dr. Gutierrez hesitated for a moment before responding. It's a complicated biological process. Yes, professor, replied Noemi. But who created that biological process? How is it possible that a cow, an animal without intellectual capacity, produces milk so perfectly suited for both human and animal consumption? If all this happened by chance, how could such an accurate and beneficial mechanism have come to be? Noemi continued. Professor, if you found a glass of milk on your desk, you would naturally assume someone put it there. It would be irrational to believe it appeared on its own. She smiled and concluded, if even a simple glass of milk requires someone to serve it, how can a far more complex biological system exist without having been created by someone? This proves that there is a supreme and intelligent being who designed everything in detail. We call that being God. The room fell completely silent. No one said a word. Some students began to whisper among themselves. For the first time, Dr. Hector Brau had no immediate response. Noemi's father looked at her with pride. His daughter had just presented a simple yet logical argument that was difficult to refute. Dr. Eduardo took a deep breath and finally said, Interesting, Noemi, truly interesting. All eyes remained fixed on him. For the first time, he seemed deeply reflective, and his usual confidence showed signs of doubt. A student whispered from the middle row, Amazing. Our professor has just been outmatched by a student. The murmur was loud enough for several to hear. Some chuckled, while others remained absorbed in thought. Although visibly unsettled, Dr. Eduardo kept his composure. He drew a faint smile and remarked, Noemi, your argument is fascinating, but it still doesn't constitute proof of God's existence. What you call the miracle of milk is simply the result of natural laws developed over billions of years through evolution. It's the process of natural selection, not the intervention of a divine creator. Noemi remained calm. She looked at the professor with a confident gaze. Professor, she said, if I gave you a random set of letters and asked you to arrange them into a perfect book, how long would it take you? Dr. Eduardo Rivers answered, It would depend on a number of letters and the complexity of the book, but it would certainly take a long time. Noemi nodded. And if those letters were tossed into the air, would they fall into a perfect order and form a coherent book? The professor slowly shook his head. Of course not. That would be impossible. Noemi smiled gently. Then how can you believe that billions of atoms in the human body, in the universe, and in every organism came together perfectly just by chance? Once again, the classroom fell into complete silence. The students who had previously laughed were now fully attentive and serious. It seemed they were reconsidering what she had just said. A professor at the back of the room whispered to a colleague, This girl is far too insightful for her age. Dr. Eduardo's smile faded slightly, and a trace of concern appeared in his eyes. However, he quickly regained his composure and said, Noelia, I understand your argument, but let me ask you a question. If God really exists, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why are there wars, poverty, disease, and injustice? If God is pure love, why does he allow these things to happen? Several audience members nodded in agreement. A young woman sitting in the front row murmured, "That's a complicated question. I'm curious to hear her response." Noelia, without hesitation, fixed her gentle gaze on the professor and asked, "Professor, have you ever been inside an operating room?" Dr. Eduardo frowned slightly. "Of course. I've witnessed surgeries in various hospitals. And when a doctor performs surgery, does the patient feel pain?" The professor reflected for a few seconds. Without anesthesia, they obviously feel pain. Noelia nodded. "Then why does the doctor proceed with the surgery, knowing it causes pain?" Dr. Eduardo exhaled slowly. "Because it's necessary to heal the patient." Noelia smiled. "Exactly. The same thing happens in life, Professor. Sometimes God allows us to suffer. Not because he is indifferent, but because there is a greater purpose, just like a doctor operates to heal. God allows people to go through trials for a reason." She looked at him with a soft but firm expression. "Professor, have you ever seen parents teaching their child to walk?" Dr. Eduardo furrowed his brow slightly and then nodded. "Yes, of course. And when a child takes their first steps, don't they stumble and fall?" Dr. Eduardo sighed. "Yes, that happens all the time." Do the parents rush to stop the child from falling again? Do they carry the child constantly so that he never has to make an effort? Dr. Eduardo remained silent for a few moments before shaking his head. "No, they let the child try again so that he can learn." Noelia smiled. "Exactly, Professor. If parents never let go of their child's hand, if they always protected him from making mistakes, he would never learn to walk on his own. He would remain weak and dependent forever." She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. "Allah granted us free will, the ability to choose between good and evil, so that we may learn, grow, and gain wisdom. If he forced us to always act righteously, we would be like programmed machines, with no real meaning or purpose behind our actions. The true beauty of choosing good lies in the fact that it comes from within, not from external imposition." A silence filled the classroom. Some students, who had previously shown skepticism, now seemed immersed in deep reflection. Several exchanged glances, their expressions softening, as if something had just clicked in their minds. Even Dr. Eduardo, so firm in his convictions, seemed speechless for a moment. In one corner of the room, an elderly man stroked his white beard and whispered softly, "Subhanallah, this young woman possesses great wisdom." However, Dr. Eduardo was not ready to give in. He crossed his arms, narrowed his eyes at Noelia, and asked in a penetrating voice, "Very well, Noelia, if God exists, why doesn't he manifest himself? If I could see him, touch him, or speak to him directly, then I would believe in his existence." Noelia gave a slight smile. "Professor, do you have a brain?" The room filled with whispers and restrained laughter. Some students covered their mouths to avoid laughing openly. Dr. Eduardo let out a short chuckle and replied with a nod. "Of course I have a brain, Noelia. But have you ever seen it?" she asked innocently. Dr. Eduardo's smile faded. He hesitated, and the atmosphere grew tense, as if everyone sensed that this was an important moment. Noelia continued, her voice confident. "Have you ever touched it or spoken to it directly?" Dr. Eduardo remained silent for a long while, thoughtful. Finally, he exhaled and confessed quietly, "No, I've never seen my own brain, but I know it's there because I can think and function as a human being." Noelia smiled with satisfaction. "That is how we can understand that God exists. Perhaps we don't see him directly, but we perceive his presence in every heartbeat and in the air we breathe. His being is as tangible as the thoughts in our mind and the life flowing through our body. Just like the brain, it's not necessary to see him to know he is there." The room erupted in applause. Some students who had previously doubted now nodded in agreement, while others wiped away tears. Dr. Eduardo remained silent, his gaze deep and reflective. For the first time in his life, he had no immediate response. He looked at Noelia with renewed respect. However, before he could say anything else, a voice from the back of the classroom interrupted the applause. "Professor, don't let a little girl defeat you. She's just playing with words," said the voice coldly. All eyes turned to the man standing by the door. He wore a black suit and had a serious, unshakable demeanor. It was one of Dr. Eduardo's colleagues, Dr. Michael Thompson, a renowned scientist and one of the university's most passionate atheists. The atmosphere, which had begun to calm, grew tense once again. Noelia turned her gaze toward him, her eyes full of calm and confidence. She knew the discussion was far from over. There were still many questions to be addressed. Dr. Michael stepped forward, his eyes reflecting sharp skepticism. "Very well, young lady," he said, crossing his arms. "You seem quite convinced of your ideas. But before we continue, let me ask you a question. Do you consider Islam a religion based on love?" Noelia nodded firmly. "Without a doubt, Professor. Islam is a faith of love, compassion, and justice." Dr. Michael let out a sarcastic laugh. "Love and compassion," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "Then tell me this. If Islam is truly a religion of peace, how do you explain so much violence and bloodshed committed in its name? How do you justify the wars that have been waged under the banner of your faith? If your belief is so genuine, why do some people use it to justify harming others?" A murmur rippled through the room. Some students nodded at the question, while others waited in expectant silence. Noelia remained quiet for a few seconds, then took a deep breath and answered with serenity and precision. "Professor, do you consider knives to be useful tools?" Dr. Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" "Knives," Noelia repeated. "Do you think they are valuable tools?" Dr. Michael hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "Yes, of course. They're used for cooking and cutting things. They're essential in daily life." Noelia gave a slight smile. "But, Professor, don't you think knives can also be used to harm others?" Dr. Michael's expression changed, as if he was beginning to understand the direction of the conversation. "If someone uses a knife to commit a crime," Noelia continued, "should we blame the knife or the person who misused it?" Silence fell over the room again. Some students looked at one another, murmuring about the strength of the girl's reasoning. Dr. Michael pressed his lips together, but Noelia wasn't done yet. "Professor, there are people who misuse science to create weapons of mass destruction. Should we blame science itself for the harm it causes?" Dr. Michael exhaled heavily, but remained silent for a few moments. Noelia continued, "Islam is a faith that preaches peace, but there are those who distort its teachings for selfish purposes, just as some misuse science, technology, or even politics for wrongful ends. The problem doesn't lie in Islam itself, but in how humans choose to use or abuse it." The room grew quiet. Some students who had initially doubted her words now appeared deep in thought. Several nodded, clearly persuaded. Dr. Michael took a deep breath, as if he were about to respond, but stopped. His expression changed. It no longer reflected arrogance, but something else, a kind of introspection. Finally, he spoke again. "All right," he said, in a softer tone than before. "I understand your reasoning, but I still have one last question for you." He leaned slightly forward, narrowing his eyes. "If God really exists, why doesn't he prevent evil from appearing in the first place? Why does he allow people to choose to do wrong?" Noelia's expression turned gentler, and though her voice was soft, it was resolute. "Professor," she asked, "have you ever seen a parent teaching their child how to walk?" Dr. Michael frowned slightly. "Yes, of course. And so, The discussion resumed, but this time, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Skepticism still lingered, but something else had emerged, a silent and evident curiosity. Do they always hold the child so that they never fall? Noelia asked. Dr. Michael shook his head. No, they let the child try on their own. Noelia smiled. Why do they let them fall? She asked. Dr. Michael was quiet for a moment, as if reflecting, and then replied, because if the child never stumbles, they'll never learn how to stand or walk properly. Noelia thought that this was precisely how Allah teaches. He didn't create humans as automatons without freedom. He gave us the ability to choose between good and evil, because only through that choice can we understand the true value of good. The whispers in the room began to fade. The students who had doubted at first now showed different expressions, some surprised, others contemplative. But Dr. Michael wasn't ready to yield. He spoke again. But Noelia, if God is truly loving, why does hell exist? Why would he punish those who don't believe in him? The question prompted several students to nod in agreement. It was one of the most common concerns in theological debates. Noelia remained calm. She looked at Dr. Michael and answered softly. Professor, do you consider yourself a good teacher? Dr. Michael gave a faint smile. Of course. And do you evaluate your students with exams? Dr. Michael nodded. Yes, it's part of the educational system. If some students don't prepare, don't make an effort, and fail the exam, would you still give them the highest grade? Dr. Michael shook his head firmly. Of course not. If they don't study, they don't deserve high marks. Noelia smiled gently. That's how life works, Professor. God tests us and gives us all the guidance needed to pass. But if someone chooses to ignore those instructions, is it fair for them to receive the same heavenly reward as those who try to do good? Dr. Michael fell silent. Some students who had shown doubt at first were now beginning to grasp the core of Noelia's reasoning. Suddenly, a student in the last row exclaimed, Of course. My God, that makes sense. Dr. Michael took a deep breath. For the first time during the whole exchange, he seemed to have no immediate response. He looked at Noelia with an expression that was hard to define, a mix of surprise, confusion, and the signs of someone beginning to consider a perspective they hadn't before. But just before he could speak again, another student abruptly stood up. I still have a question for Noelia, he said firmly. The room tensed again. The debate was far from over. A charged atmosphere lingered as everyone awaited Noelia's answer to the question posed by the young man who had just stood, a boy with curly hair and casual clothing who held the microphone tightly. His name was Francisco. I admit your reasoning is very coherent, he said firmly, but something troubles me. Allah is compassionate and just, but how can he forgive our sins? How is it possible that he allows us to enter paradise after all the harm we've done? This was a common issue in theological discussions, and now Noelia had to provide an answer that appealed to both the reason and the emotions of everyone present. Noelia gave a faint smile and then addressed Francisco. Have you ever been in love? Francisco frowned, not expecting his question to be answered with another. Of course, but what does that have to do with this? When you fall in love, do you want that person to love you because they truly know you and understand your heart? Or would you prefer them to love you only because they feel forced to, or because they have no other option? Francisco said nothing. He was beginning to see where Noelia's reasoning was heading, but he let the conversation continue. If God made himself plainly visible to everyone, there would be no room for faith or free will. Everyone would believe simply because they have no choice. But God wants us to love and trust him with a sincere heart, not because we're forced by undeniable proof. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to deep reflection. The students who had once been skeptical now looked thoughtful. Dr. Michael, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. "So, you believe that God wants people to choose him from the heart, not out of compulsion?" he asked quietly. "God gives us the freedom to seek the truth. He has left numerous signs in our hearts, in the cosmos, and in his scriptures. But the choice to perceive those signs lies with us." Dr. Michael inhaled deeply. "I've spent many years of my life trying to find answers, trying to prove that God doesn't exist, but the argument you've made today has made me reconsider." Several students looked shocked. A renowned atheist professor was beginning to question his own convictions. It wasn't something that happened often. Francisco leaned back in his chair, his expression no longer one of resistance, but of confusion. His heart seemed to be in conflict with his mind. Dr. Span, who had been part of the debate with Kayla from the beginning, gave a slight smile. "I didn't expect this conversation to make me reflect more than argue," he said. Kayla gave a slight smile. "Islam is not just a subject for debates, Professor. Islam is about the heart, our connection with Allah, and how we use reason to discover the truth." The entire room fell silent. No one dared to ask questions, not out of fear, but because they were reflecting on something they may have overlooked. Perhaps there was something deeper they could not grasp with logic alone. When the debate ended, several students approached Kayla. Some wanted to continue the conversation, while others simply wished to thank her for showing them a new way of seeing things. Francisco, who had questioned Kayla, finally said, "I don't know if I can accept the existence of God immediately, but I will start looking for the answer more seriously." Kayla responded with a warm smile. "The search for truth is a wonderful path, Francisco. I pray you find it." Dr. Michael left the classroom with a thoughtful expression. His face no longer showed the intellectual arrogance he had at the beginning of the debate. Something had changed inside him, something that might lead him to reconsider his beliefs. For now, he left the place peacefully. He had fulfilled his mission to convey the truth gently, with kindness, and with convincing logic. Just like the glass of milk I used earlier as a comparison, the truth always appears transparent. Only those who truly wish to perceive it will understand how valuable it is to come to know it. This message highlights the importance of sharing the truth, the tenderness that must accompany communicating it, and the need to use both mind and heart to find answers. I hope this story serves all of us to learn and draw closer to the truth. We will meet again in the next story full of inspiration.